Well, October 31st will feature another full moon in 2020, but it doesn't matter what year that you're watching this information all applies. And I'm going to go over first, just jump right into it. The number one priority that you need to pay attention to with the moon is when there's a full moon rising. You're not going to have that great of hunting in the evening, even with the weather. Now, weather always trumps the moon, but at the same time, when you have that bright moon rising in the evening, deer, mature bucks in general, whatever it might be, whatever type of whitetail, they're moving to their evening food source a lot later. And so to me, a lot of times they're moving past the hours that you're sitting in a tree stand. But then an explosion takes place at night. It's safe, social, bright, and a lot of times those bucks are living high in the hog all night. They're exerting themselves. The entire deer herd is living high in the hog, eating a lot of food. Again, it's safe and social. And then they're heading back to those bedding areas at daybreak, and a lot of times they'll even beat you to your stand if you have a bedding area stand with that full moon. So think about that as you're going into a stand, even a bedding area stand during the pre-rut this year. Is that full moon rising the night before? Did it affect the feeding cycles of the deer? And if so, you're going to find that those deer are bedded down at daybreak when you go into a stand, so be very careful getting into bedding areas, especially near a mature buck bedding area. Make sure that you're not placing as much of a focus on the evening hunt, even if the weather's good, because those deer are going to be moving later in the evening. And then finally, what does that all set up? That means that late morning, there's going to be a really good priority for those deer to get out of their beds because they're bedded down at daybreak and they're going to start feeding. That all is influenced by the feeding cycles of deer. They feed 5 times in a 24-hour period. I say that to no end, and will continue to do so. They feed 5 times in a 24-hour period. That would be around daybreak, late morning, afternoon, right before dark. Those are the 3 daylight feedings, number 1, 2, and 3. And then feedings 4 and 5 are after dark. Well, when a full moon's rising, they're feeding on a lot of food and exerting a lot of energy during the middle of the night, during feedings 4 and 5. That means the next feeding, they're not going to feed as much. It's kind of like us. We feed a lot one feeding, we're not the next time. So that means at daybreak, they're bedded down. That means they're feeding a lot here. They're not feeding as much right down here. They're feeding a lot in 4 and 5. They're not feeding in number 1. That means number 2, they're going to feed a lot more. And so that's where those morning stands, where you can enter away from bedding areas, but get into a remote location with a remote small food source, maybe a small food plot, but most of the times mature bucks are not bedded by those food plots. I'm looking more towards an apple tree, an oak tree, a random oak flat, briars, hardwood regeneration patch, something with a natural food source that's near a buck bedding area that'll pull them out of that. And I see a lot of times those bucks, what I've experienced personally is they'll move up to 100 yards. They might even move 150 yards from their food source as long as they're back in that cover from their bedding area to get to that food source during that late morning time, and it brings up a great opportunity. That's one of the most important points that you should remember about the moon as it influences any kind of deer movement. Number 2, make sure you always remember the moon has zero rut influence over when does are actually coming into estrus. And when the rut begins, there is absolutely zero rut influence. Pretty interesting. John Azoga, the research up in Vermont and Azoga, and the other guys that were up there at the Camp Cousino Deer Research Facility in northern Michigan. I don't remember the numbers, but it was in the thousands, whether it was 1,000 or 2,000 does that they were able to ultrasound and go back to the date of conception or over a decade's period of time. And so they were able to see. And this is an old deer and deer hunting article. There are contrasting articles back then, the late Charles Alsheimer and then John Azoga. There's a lot of controversy because on one hand, the moon affects everything. On the other hand, Azoga is saying that decades of research have shown that the date of conception did not change at all compared to anything. If the weather was bad and hot, they just bred more at night. But regardless, the moon did not affect rutting activity, and every study now shows that the moon does not affect rutting behavior, estrus in any way. Number 3, the weather trumps the moon. There's all kinds of moon predictions out there that you really don't need to follow. But if you follow them at all, always think, if it's a great moon phase day, but it's a bad weather day, you're gonna have a bad hunt. Again, weather trumps the moon. If it's a great weather day, but a bad moon phase day, you're going to have a great hunt. You see the trend. The moon, let's say it did influence 1%, 2%, 3%. The other 95% or 90% of the driving factor of daily movement and daylight movement, and that even goes back to the rut. The rut and the does are going to be coming into estrus at the same time every year. But if there's great weather, there's going to be a lot more breeding taking place during the daylight, a lot more mature buck movement, cruising during the daylight. And then if there's bad weather, high winds, stormy weather, warm weather, that rutting activity is still going to be taking place. It's going to be taking place at night. That's where a lot of the scientific studies, they'll look at it like, well, the rutting takes place at the same time every year, so the weather couldn't have any influence on. We're not talking about weather influencing breeding or when does come into estrus, but there's a huge correlation between mature buck movement during the daylight when the weather is optimum based on our hunt cast forecasts or my hunt cast forecasts, the forecasts and the prediction model that I infused into hunt cast. Weather trumps moon. Always remember, if it's a great weather day and a bad moon phase day, go hunting. If it's a great moon phase day and a bad weather day, you probably should sit on the couch. And you can shoot a lot more deer sitting on the couch. That's where smart hunters hunt. And how they hunt is a lot of planning. You select the days, you're choosy about the days you go hunting. More time in the stand does not equal more bucks. In fact, it's the opposite. Being smart, sitting on the couch, being patient, learning when to actually hunt, what the true influences are of movement, that's going to lead you to success. And really, when it comes down to it, maybe we could even start with this one. The number one thing that maybe you should pay attention with the moon, other than outside of those feeding phases, that late morning feeding time, is heck, do you need a flashlight in the woods or not? Really, that's kind of what it boils down to. Full moon, maybe you don't need a flashlight. No full moon, dark moon, maybe you need a flashlight. That's one thing to consider. And it actually is something I considered for years going into the woods. And finally, number 5, I can't reemphasize this enough, morning, late morning priority. That would be during phase number 2 or bedding opportunity number 2, feeding opportunity number 2. Yeah, it starts in the morning at daybreak. If they're bedded down already, really watch when you get into a morning bedding area that you're not spooking out deer. Try to take advantage of that late morning during a full moon time, that feeding opportunity. I've had some great success with that. Really watch that. So that full moon on October 31st really is going to enhance the hunting, I believe, on the November 6th period of time, November 7th. Once that full moon phase is passed and that full moon is rising after dark, you don't have that bright light coming into the sky during your evening hunt. It's several hours after, 2 hours after. Think about that. If they're not moving a lot at one time, whether it's feeding, general activity, weather related or not, they're going to be moving a lot when that phase passes. Look at that happening around November 6th this year, a few days, November 4th, just a few short days after the full moon. Look for that full moon to be rising in some type of bright sky, even around October 28th, 29th. Really look at some strong pre-rut activity this year in a lot of states during the 20th to the 28th of October. There might be a little bit of a lag time there, even though it's right in the middle of the rut, even with good weather. I'd still hunt. I'm still getting into my best bedding area stands in the morning during that time of year and expecting to shoot some deer. Not saying not to hunt, but really think about how the moon truly affects your hunt this year. Don't let it influence your rut dates. I know everyone wants to tell their boss that they're going to take these dates and hunt, 9 months in advance and take that time, but a lot of times it can lead you down a rabbit hole of unsuccess when it comes to whitetails. And I encourage you to take these moonisms and how you bow hunt whitetails this year and beyond. That's why it doesn't really matter when you're seeing this. We have the full moon taking place October 31st. Whatever date it is this year, these same moonisms will be in effect and guide you to success this fall and beyond. Well, if you made it to the end of this video, you're obviously interested in whitetail habitat solutions, what I have to teach, and you will love my new web class series. The first one is how to design your whitetail property. It's out now. The link is in the description. I invite you to check it out. It's on my website. Can't wait to hear about it.